August 17th, 1943. Somewhere on the rolling hills of Normandy, a Tiger I tank sits silent and dead. Its engine still smolders, its massive tracks half buried in mud. Corporal Alan Mercer of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers crawls through the open hatch, flashlight beam cutting through the grease-choked air. He isn't searching for maps or documents. He's after metal. The Tiger's interior feels more like a steel cathedral than a vehicle. The gearbox, the Maybach Olvar transmission, sits like a shrine of machined precision. But Mercer can see it's jammed. A fracture runs through one of the drive gears, a clean, crystalline split as if the metal had snapped like glass. He turns to his superior, Major David Hollis. "Not battle damage, sir," Mercer says. "Looks like she killed herself." Hollis nods, jotting it down. Another one for the analysis team back in Chobham. By nightfall, British engineers winch the Tiger's broken transmission out and cradle it onto a flatbed truck bound for England. Few at the front realize it yet. But this single gearbox will expose a flaw at the heart of Germany's most feared weapon. 3 weeks later, the crated remains arrive at the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment in Chobham, Surrey. Inside a long brick lab, beneath a sign reading, "Metallurgical investigation, handle with care." A team of civilian and military scientists in white coats crowd around their new specimen. The air smells of oil, steel, and anticipation. Dr. Leonard Tovey, chief metallurgist, a thin man with steady hands and a Welsh accent softened by years of lab discipline, slides a micrometer along the gear's teeth. The readings make him pause. 62 HRC, he mutters. "Good Lord, that's harder than a razor edge." A younger assistant leans in. "That's a good thing, isn't it, sir? Hard steel means strong." Tovey shakes his head slowly. "Not if it's too hard. Not when you've got 50 tons of panzers sitting on it." They place the gear under a magnifying scope. The surface gleams like polished chrome, but beneath it lie tiny lattices of brittle martensite, a metallurgical minefield. Tovey scribbles notes. Case hardened, insufficient tempering, prone to shock fracture. Within hours, a machine grinds into motion. They cut a cross-section sample from one tooth, bathe it in acid etchant, and slide it under the microscope. On the projection screen, the structure glows like a frozen forest. Needle-shaped crystals signaling metal pushed beyond its limits. Tovey straightens up, glasses reflecting the image. "They've over-hardened it," he says. "In the rush to make them strong, they've made them fragile." For the first time, the scientists begin to grasp the truth that frontline crews had only suspected. The Tiger's greatest weakness isn't its armor, its gun, or its size. It's the very gears that try to move it. Outside, rain rattles against the windows. In the yard, captured German machines, half-tracks, Panzer IVs, a battered Stug 3, sit under canvas tarps. Each one a lesson in what happens when a nation tries to build a war machine faster than its engineers can make it work. By midnight, the lab is silent except for the steady click of a Rockwell hardness tester. Tovey records another set of readings. Same numbers, same problem. It's no fluke. He leans back and writes a line in his report that will echo through Allied intelligence briefings for months to come. German production pressure has sacrificed tempering for speed. Result: catastrophic gear failure under combat stress. The Tiger, once the symbol of German invincibility, has a fatal Achilles heel buried inside its own engine block. And the men at Chobham are just beginning to pull the thread. August 23rd, 1943. Chobham, Surrey. Oh, Dr. Leonard Tovey stood at the bench with his pipe unlit between his teeth. On the table lay a tray of broken samples, gear teeth, bearing races, and shafts fractured so cleanly they looked machined. "All right, gentlemen," he said, tapping a pointer against the cracked surface of a drive gear. "What you're looking at is a perf." He gestured toward a nearby chalkboard where one of his assistants had written R. The young officer from the War Office looked puzzled. "So the harder the metal, the weaker it becomes?" "In a sense, they ran the gear through a Charpy impact test. The pendulum swung, struck the sample, and the piece snapped in two with a sharp, metallic crack. A few sparks jumped off the fracture face. Too clean, M. Tovinen. That evening, the lab dimmed its lights, and the team gathered around a projector screen. Black and white film footage began to roll, captured from British and American recovery crews in Tunisia. Tigers bogged down, their engines roaring before cutting off abruptly. Crews abandoning them in panic as the heavy beasts refused to move. One clip showed a tiger in El Guetar spinning its tracks uselessly before a plume of smoke poured from its rear compartment. Tovey froze the frame. "There," he said, pointing with a pencil. "Transmission seizure. That's not from battle. That's from this same over." The War Office officer exhaled. "How many fail like this?" Tovey flipped through his notes. "Our intelligence estimates, as high as 50% of all Tigers built have experienced drivetrain failure before combat. Most never even reached the front." A silence filled the room. For months, Allied troops had spoken of the Tiger with a kind of dread. Its invincible armor, its 80-8mm gun, its ability to shred Shermans from a mile away. Yet here, in a dim lab in Surrey, they had discovered that the German monster could be killed not by firepower, but by its own design. Tovey drew a quick diagram on the blackboard. Gear mesh patterns, stress vectors, thermal gradients. "They hardened the outer layer too deep," he explained. "But they didn't temper it long enough afterward. You end up with a steel tooth that looks perfect until the moment you need it most." One of the younger metallurgists, Lieutenant Reeves, spoke up. "Why would they risk that? The Germans aren't fools." "No," Tovey said quietly. "But they're desperate. By 43, their factories are bombed, their skilled workers are gone, and they're pushing tanks off the line as fast as they can. Quality control takes too long. A proper tempering cycle can take hours. Under Göring's directives, that's time they simply don't have." Reeves frowned. "So the Tiger's failure was built into its birth." "Precisely." Later that night, the team compiled a full metallurgical report. Micrographs were labeled, hardness profiles drawn, and failure patterns cataloged. Tovey signed the final page. "Excessive surface hardness and inadequate tempering in all samples tested. Likely cause of multiple catastrophic transmission failures in Tiger series tanks." He underlined one word: catastrophic. The next morning, a courier from the Ministry of Supply arrived in a raincoat, carrying orders stamped "Most Secret." He collected the documents, sealed them in a canvas pouch, and disappeared down the corridor. By afternoon, the findings would be sitting on the desk of Brigadier George Simons, head of British Technical Intelligence. As the engineers cleaned up the lab, Reeves lingered behind, staring at the fractured gears under the microscope. "You know, sir," he said to Tovey, "it's ironic. The Germans built the strongest tank in the world, and it can't even drive itself to battle." Tovey smiled thinly. "War is full of ironies, Lieutenant, but this one may have just saved thousands of lives." Outside, the rain had stopped. The mist cleared over the test fields, where other captured machines waited under tarps. Somewhere in the distance, the rumble of a running engine echoed, a reminder that the war of machines was also a war of materials, of chemistry, of decisions made in haste. In Berlin, those same decisions were being made under sirens and pressure. As Allied bombers pounded factories in Kassel and Henschel struggled to meet quotas, Foreman cut tempering times again. Each shortcut produced another Tiger doomed to die, not in battle, but on the road there. And in that quiet lab in Surrey, the British metallurgists had just uncovered the most damning secret of German engineering. Strength without endurance. Brilliance without patience. September 2nd, 1943. Kassel, Germany. The Hoe, inside the heat and smoke. A foreman named Kurt Meinhardt W.W. "Get them out," he barred. His assistant hesitates. "But the hardening, I said ship them." Meinhardt snaps. "Do you want the Gestapo to ask why we missed the—" The young machinist nods silently. He's seen what happens to men who argue with quotas. The gears are crated, stamped with the Henschel eagle, and rolled out toward the freight depot. Another batch. Meanwhile, in England, the Chobham report has reached Brigadier the Ma. At Bovington's Proving Grounds, British tank crews gather around a captured Tiger, chassis number 250M122, the one recovered from Tunisia months before. The vehicle looms over them like a prehistoric beast, its armor dented but unbroken, its gun pointed toward a gray English sky. Captain William, an instructor from the Row. "Strong as a fortress," he says. "But it's all for nothing if it can't move." He gestures to a clipboard where the Chobham engineers have summarized their findings. Transmission fragility, over-hardened gears, repeated mechanical seizure. "Gentlemen," Hargram, he orders his driver to engage first gear. The captured Maybach engine roars, then sputters as the transmission growls like a dying animal. Metal grinds. A loud crack echo. Hargi. He jots a note in his logbook. Field demonstration confirms gear frag if the Tiger could be. Across the chain, at Kurs, Tiger C. Oberfeldwebel Ern, Hadwa, Graf's driver, young Heinz, kick. Word spread quickly among panzer crews. The Tiger's heart. Back in Chobham, Dr. Tovey's lab continued its relentless investigation. They now had several gear samples from different captured Tigers, each telling the same story. Using microscopes and fracture diagrams, Tovey reconced high carbon content, carburized to extra, temperin by hour. Result, Martins. He drew the entire process on a chalkboard, labeling each step. Lieutenant Reeves nodded. So the harder they worked to make it indestructible, the more they destroyed it. "Exact," he ordered. The results were sent to the ministry, with one final observation. In September 10th. Kassel again. Nay. When the all-clear sounds hours later, he sits alone beside a shattered window, staring at a half-finished gear lying on his desk. He taps it with a wrench. It rings like glass. "We built the best tank in the—" He doesn't know that miles away, British analysts are reading his failures as V. By October, Allied intelligence has begun to incorporate Chobham's data into their own battlefield strategy memos. Reports circulate among U.S. and British units. Tiger I, prone to mechanical failure. Avoid direct engagement. Target logistics. Force movement over ROU. It changes how the war is fought. Commanders no longer see the Tiger as an unstoppable god of war, but as a fragile priest. At Chobham, Tovey quietly files the final addendum to his report. German steel has become He watches as the sample trays are sealed and sent for archival storage. Each fractured tooth tells a story not of strength, but of overreach. Of a nation that tried to harden its steel as it hardened its heart, until and outside, through the glass walls of the lab, the rumble of British tanks in training fields grows louder, not perfect machines. The age of the invincible Tiger was ending, one broken gear at a time. October 18th, 1943. Chobham Proving Ground, Surrey. "The more, gentlemen," he said, stepping forward, clipboard in hand. "You're looking at a paradox in steel. The Tiger's transmission, its so-called beating heart, is both its masterpiece and its failure. He gestured toward the massive gearbox laid out on the ground, split open like an autopsy subject. Inside, the fractured gear teeth caught the gray light like broken glass. 62 Rockwell hardness, he said. That's a figure you expect in cutting tools, not in moving machinery. At these levels, the steel ceases to be ductile. It forgets how. A colonel from the Ministry of Supply leaned closer. And that's W. Tovey nodded. Yes. Same pattern. Same crystalline fracture. The Germans made these parts so hard they can't survive the shock of their own power. An aide scribbled notes. Another snapped photographs. Tovey Co. They're victims of their own efficiency. Under Göring's orders, Henschel shortened tempering cycles from hours to minutes. Production quotas meant the steel was quenched and shipped before it had time to breathe. The result? Magnificent machines that fail before they even fire a shot. The colonel frowned. So, half their Tigers never even reached the front? Tovey tapped his pen against the gearbox. At least half. Intelligence from captured crews confirms that many broke down on their way to battle. They didn't lose them to our guns. They lost the. He turned to a chalkboard propped nearby, covered in sketches, stress-strain curves, phase diagrams, and the telltale needle-shaped martensite that betrayed rushed hardening. Every one of these gears looks perfect until you put 200 horsepower through it. Then it becomes a grenade. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the group. But the tone was serious. The Tiger, the terror of Allied tankers, had just been stripped of its myth by a few English scientists and a microscope. Inside the lab that afternoon, the examination deepened. Technicians in oil-stained coveralls fed a section of gear into a metallographic saw, slicing it open for study. The machine shrieked. Sparks danced across the floor. When the piece finally split, Tovey leaned in with a loop. There it is again, he said softly. Grain boundaries full of martensite, too brittle to sustain torsion. Look here, Reeves. See this river pattern? That's a catastrophic crack propagating at the speed of sound. Lieutenant Reeves nodded, tracing the surface with a pencil. So one torque spike, one clutch misfire, boom. Precisely. The Germans built something magnificent that could never forgive a single mistake. They tested another sample in the drop hammer. The steel shattered. Another from a Panther gearbox. Same result. Tovey lit his pipe and stood silently as the pieces cooled. You know, Reeves, he said, it's the story of their war in miniature. They pursued perfection so hard they forgot endurance. The Tiger's armor could stop anything, except time and fatigue. In Berlin, at that same hour, Henschel's engineers were drafting reports to the Waffenamt about increasing field complaints. Gearbox failures, clutch explosions, overheating. Commanders raged at the delays. Field workshops lacked replacement parts. One memo, intercepted weeks later by British intelligence, read, "Due to pressure for rapid output, certain batches have shown premature wear or breakage of drive gears. Recommend operators avoid sudden changes between second and third gear under load." Translated, it meant, do not drive the Tiger as intended. By late October, the British had converted their findings into strategy. The War Office issued a confidential technical note to Allied tank commanders. Enemy heavy tank reliability estimated at less than 50 miles average operational range before major mechanical failure. Avoid direct confrontation. Engage through sustained pressure and terrain obstacles. Mechanical failure will accomplish what firepower cannot. For the first time, the Allied High Command saw a way to neutralize the Tiger without needing to outgun it, let it drive itself to death. Back at Chobham, the Tiger test continued into the night. Under floodlights, The British mechanics reassembled the transmission and prepared a stress simulation. They filled the system with oil, connected torque gauges, and started the Maybach HL230 engine. The roar filled the hangar, echoing like thunder. "Engage first," Tovey called. The driver eased the lever forward. The gears meshed, then screeched. A metallic crack rang out. The entire assembly shuddered and stopped dead. Everyone froze. Tovey stepped forward, tapping the fractured housing with his pen. "Gentlemen," he said, "you've just witnessed the Tiger's death sentence." He turned to Reeves. "File the report. Send a copy to Bovington and one to Washington. Tell them this isn't just metallurgy. It's a window into German industry itself." Reeves raised an eyebrow. "Meaning, sir? That they're running out of patience, out of temper, and soon, out of steel that can survive their ambition." 2 weeks later, a summary of the Chobham report crossed the desks of the Allied Combined Intelligence Committee. It was short, clinical, and devastating. Captured examination confirmed structural brittleness in critical transmission components of PZK-PFW-6 Tiger. Over-hardening procedures and reduced tempering cycles contributing to severe in-service failures. Estimated 50% non-combat attrition rate due to mechanical unreliability. Recommend continued strain on enemy supply and production infrastructure to amplify degradation effects. In simpler words, keep the pressure on. The Tigers will break themselves. As November began, fog rolled over Chobham again. The test yard was empty now, the Tiger's broken transmission stored in a crate marked Evidence A, Metallurgical Report, number 47. Tovey stood by the window, watching the mist swallow the horizon. He thought of the German engineers who had designed the Tiger, men not unlike himself, devoted to precision, enslaved by pressure. "They tried to forge immortality in steel," he murmured, and forgot that even steel can crack. Behind him, the test lights flickered off one by one. The lab that had broken the Tiger legend went dark for the night. November 4th, 1943. Kassel, Germany. The Henschel plant was still smoking from the last Allied bombing run. Roof panels gaped open to the sky, and soot drifted like snow across the machine floor. The night shift worked in silence, faces half lit by the glow of furnaces. Inside the forge room, a row of young metallurgists watched the tempering clock tick down. 30 minutes instead of 3 hours. A foreman in a leather apron barked, "Pull it now. Berlin wants this batch out before dawn." The steel workers hesitated. It wasn't ready. The metal was still singing with internal strain. But orders were orders. They pulled the glowing gears from the furnace, quenched them too fast in oil, and stacked them in crates. The air filled with the hiss of cooling steel and the faint, sharp scent of disaster. In another corner, engineer Kurt Meinhardt lit a cigarette and stared at the production ledger. Every line screamed compromise. Shortened tempering, reused alloy, recycled slag. He rubbed his eyes. They were building the Tiger, but not the one they'd designed. He flipped through a stack of field reports. Gear seizure near Bryansk. Transmission failure, Kursk. Final drive destroyed, Italy. The words blurred together like a litany. Meinhardt muttered under his breath, "We're building statues, not tanks." He knew if he sent the warning upward, it would vanish in bureaucracy, or worse. Men had already disappeared for questioning production quotas. And so, he did what most engineers did in wartime Germany. He signed off the inspection form and prayed the front never saw his signature. Across the channel, the Chobham team continued their quiet work in the same month. The war outside roared louder every week. Italy invaded, bombers over Hamburg, the Eastern Front on fire. But in the lab, the battle was microscopic. Dr. Leonard Tovey sat at his desk, surrounded by magnified photographs of fractured steel. The images looked like shattered glass, frozen in time. He sipped black tea gone cold and scribbled notes under a heading. German metallurgy under pressure. The report wasn't just about a tank anymore. It was becoming a psychological autopsy of the Reich itself. "See here," he told Lieutenant Reeves, pointing at a print pinned to the wall. "This isn't merely brittle steel. This is brittle policy. The science reflects the system. Every fracture tells the same story: rushed tempering, unchecked authority, perfectionism under fear." Reeves nodded. "You mean the same flaws that are cracking their industry are cracking their army?" "Precisely," Tovey said, tapping the edge of the photo. "Fear kills more steel than heat ever will." They began testing captured German samples not just from Tigers, but from Panthers and half-tracks. The pattern was identical. Superb surface finish, catastrophic internal stress. A new hypothesis formed: that Germany's material excellence had collapsed under its own ambition. The Reich still had world-class scientists and blueprints, but it lacked the time and labor to make them real. Quality control had become theater. Reports signed under duress, inspections skipped under bombs. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, those unseen cracks were becoming fatal. In early December, during a snowstorm near Vitebsk, a Tiger battalion attempted to retreat over frozen ground. Captain Ernst Graf, the same veteran who'd cursed his own gearbox months earlier, led the column. Halfway across a ridge, his radio crackled. "Tiger 221 down. Transmission jam." Moments later, another voice screamed through static. "Drive shaft snapped. We're immobilized." Graf slammed his fist against the periscope. The convoy was trapped. 5 Tigers frozen in place, not by the cold, but by their own metal hearts. He ordered demolition charges placed inside the hulls. The tanks that had terrified Allied troops for over a year now burned in silence, abandoned by the very machines meant to save them. Back in Berlin, the propaganda ministry would call it a strategic withdrawal. Graf called it what it was: suicide by steel. In Chaubam, news of these repeated breakdowns reached the British analysts before the newspapers did. The tone inside the lab shifted from curiosity to calculation. If the Tiger was already crumbling from within, then every mile it drove was a weapon against itself. A memorandum circulated across British command channels: "Continue to strain enemy logistics and prolong operations involving heavy armor. Increased stress on mechanical systems will amplify observed defects. Enemy armored attrition likely to rise exponentially without direct combat." Tovey read the message, folded it neatly, and set it aside. He wasn't a strategist, but he understood the weight of what they'd found. He turned to Reeves. "We didn't just uncover a flaw. We discovered a weapon that fights for us." Weeks later, Tovey was invited to London to brief senior officers at the Ministry of Supply. The war room smelled of tobacco and damp paper. Maps of Europe covered the walls, dotted with colored pins marking Tiger sightings and mechanical failures. "Gentlemen," he began, laying out photographs and metallurgical charts, "the Tiger's reputation exceeds its reality. Half never reach the field. Those that do often immobilize themselves within days. Their transmission design is beautiful, but fatally unforgiving." An officer from the War Office leaned forward. "So, you're saying we can let them destroy themselves?" "In a sense, yes," Tovey replied. "Every forced retreat, every overland pursuit accelerates the fractures. The Tiger wasn't designed for long marches. Its gears die from shock before the gun ever sees battle." The general at the head of the table nodded. "Then we'll make them march." That winter, British and American intelligence shared the Chaubam findings across Allied networks. Reports flowed to Montgomery's 8th Army and Patton's staff in the U.S. 3rd Army. By spring, the data would reach the factories, influencing how Sherman gearboxes were built, how maintenance was prioritized, how commanders viewed the myth of the Tiger. In one stroke, an analysis of steel had become strategy. Back at Chobham, as snow fell on the test yard, Tovey stood by the window and watched the flakes settle on the captured Tiger's turret. The machine looked serene now, like a ghost of war frozen in its own arrogance. Reeves joined him, holding a clipboard. Hard to believe that a few numbers on a hardness scale could change how we fight. Tovey smiled faintly. In war, Lieutenant, knowledge is artillery. Sometimes the best weapon isn't fired. It's understood. Outside, the snow thickened, muffling the sound of industry, the sound of fear. And in the stillness, a single truth echoed through the cold English air. The Tiger hadn't been defeated by shells or bombs, but by the science it refused to respect. December 12th, 1943. Chobham Research Facility, Surrey. The lab was colder than usual that morning. Frost crept across the windows, and the breath of every engineer hung in the air like faint smoke. The Tiger's transmission, disassembled and labeled part by part, lay on a steel work table that resembled an autopsy slab. Every broken tooth, every seized bearing, every misaligned shaft told the same story. Brilliance without endurance. Dr. Leonard Tovey stood in the center of the room, holding a chalk stick like a scalpel. Around him gathered a dozen officers, engineers, and metallurgists in wool coats. On the board behind him were two words written in large, deliberate strokes. Strength. He drew two simple curves, one steep and narrow, the other broad and low. Gentlemen, he said, tapping the first curve, the Germans chose this. Then he tapped the second. We chose this. He turned to the shattered gears on the table. They hardened their steel to perfection, but forgot that real strength isn't resistance. It's endurance. When you rush tempering, you trap stress. When you trap stress, you build failure. One of the officers, Colonel Henderson from the Royal Armored Corps, leaned forward. So that's why their tanks die so young. Exactly, Tovey replied. Every Tiger carries its death sentence inside the gearbox. He picked up a fragment of gear and held it toward the light. Its fractured surface sparkled like crystal. Beautiful, he said softly, and useless. In a nearby corner, Lieutenant Reeves was logging data from the Charpy impact tests. Each result was worse than the last. Where British alloy samples bent and dented under pressure, German steel snapped cleanly in half. He shook his head. It's madness, he muttered. All that effort to build something indestructible, and it dies from a bad shift. Tovey approached him, glancing over the charts. That's the irony of obsession, Reeves. When you chase perfection in isolation, you make it brittle. He looked up at the ceiling, at the faint hum of generators above. It's not just a tank problem, it's a national one. They're fighting a war of exhaustion with materials that can't flex. Across the channel, in Germany, those words were playing out in real time. December 1943, Eastern Front, near Smolensk. The snow was waist-deep. Tiger 223 of the 505th Heavy Tank Battalion strained up a slope, treads grinding over frozen mud. Inside, driver Heinz Albrecht fought the shuddering gearbox. She's slipping, he shouted. Commander Ernst leaned down. Ease it. Don't force second. Too late. A sharp kraken. They climbed out. Steam and smoke curling around the idling beast. Snow hissed on the hot armor. Graf looked back at the machine. Still magnificent, still terrifying, and yet utterly useless. 2 days later, they blew it up to keep it from falling into Russian hands. For the men who fought inside them, the Tiger wasn't a weapon anymore. It was a tomb waiting to happen. Back in Chobham, word of tea. Tiger beats. Tovey read the note aloud to the team. They're rewriting driver manuals to keep the tanks alive, he said, disbelief in his voice. A machine so advanced, it needs to be driven like fine china, Reeves chuckled darkly. It's the first tank that can kill itself with its own power, Tovey smiled thinly. And that, Lieutenant, is why they'll lose this war. He circled a section of the board labeled Internal Stress Propagation and drew lines radiating like cracks through glass. Every shortcut compounds, he explained. Bomb their factories, force faster production, and you don't just destroy tanks. You destroy the metal itself. He turned toward his team. The Tiger's transmission isn't failing in battle. It's failing before battle. That's the sign of a collapsing war economy. By Christmas, the Chobham analysis had expanded into a full-scale intelligence profile. They began studying captured German industrial processes, carburizing temperatures, cooling rates, even the chemical composition of their case-hardening compounds. Each detail painted the same picture, precision without patience. Tovey's final conclusion filled 3 pages and ended with one haunting line. The Tiger's engineering brilliance has been consumed by the political hysteria that demanded it. The War Office approved the report and classified it top secret. A copy went to the Americans, another to the Soviets through diplomatic channels. Meanwhile, deep inside the Henschel factory, the workers knew nothing of Chobham or Tovey's conclusions. They only knew that each week the deadlines grew shorter and the bombing louder. Kurt Meinhardt stood by the furnace, watching another batch of gears glow orange under the flames. He thought of his son at the front, thought of the Tiger that might one day carry him or kill him. He took a long breath and whispered to the worker beside him, "Hold the temper 2 minutes longer. Just 2. The man hesitated. "That'll slow the line." "I don't care," Meinhardt said. "If anyone asks, tell them the fire needed more air." The worker nodded. 2 extra minutes. It wasn't much. But it was something. In Surrey, snow fell outside the Chobham lab as the year drew to a close. Tovey and Reeves stood by the window, looking out over the silent test yard where the captured Tiger rested under a canvas tarp. "Hard to believe," Reeves said quietly. "That machine terrified half the world." Tovey, he too. In that reflection, the war looked smaller, more human. Not a clash of giants, but of choices. Of engineers under pressure, of steel pushed past its limit, of nations so consumed by pride that they forgot how to bend. The Tiger's armor had been perfect, its gun unmatched. But inside, in the gears no soldier ever saw, lay the secret that would doom it, a flaw that was more than mechanical. It was moral. January 5th, 1944. Kassel, Germany. The snow outside the Henschel factory had turned gray from ash. Production never stopped, not for Christmas, not for bombings, not for reason. Inside Hall 4, the air was thick with oil and desperation. Rows of young apprentices worked in silence under the glare of carbide lamps, grinding, polishing, stamping serial numbers into steel. The Tiger's transmission gears glistened on the conveyor line, flawless to the eye. Engineer Kurthis. "These need another tempering cycle." The man didn't look up. "We're already 2 hours behind schedule. If they go out like this, they'll fail in the field." The foreman's jaw hardened. "So will we if they don't. Orders from Berlin, quotas over quality. You want to argue that with the Reich Ministry? Be my guest." Meinhardt exhaled slowly. Outside, the sirens wailed again. Another Allied bombing raid. The factory's lights dimmed as the workers ran for cover, clutching helmets and toolboxes. Meinhardt stayed behind, staring at the glowing steel inside the furnace. Each piece was a mirror of Germany itself, bright, beautiful, and doomed to crack from within. When the explosions faded, he sat alone on the floor beside the half-finished gears, wiping soot from his hands. "We're not building machines anymore," he muttered. "We're building ghosts." Across the channel at Kobe, the new year brought a shift in focus. Dr. Leonard Tovey and Lieutenant Reeves were no longer just analyzing German metallurgy. They were now dissecting its philosophy. The two men stood before a blackboard filled with German production notes and failure logs. Reeves read aloud from a translated factory report captured by Allied intelligence. Tempering time reduced by 60% due to material shortages and bombing disruption. Hardness target maintained to meet Waffenamt standards. Tovey tapped his pencil against the board. "They're holding on to the illusion of precision while their foundations collapse." Reeves smirked. Perfectionism at gunpoint. They began correlating mechanical failures with production batches. The data formed a grim pattern. The more pressure Berlin applied for output, the higher the rate of field breakdowns. Entire Tiger companies were being lost not to combat, but to metallurgy. One internal memo, intercepted weeks later, confirmed their worst suspicion. Average operational lifespan of Tiger transmission, 500 kilometers. Tovey stared at the line for a long moment. 500 kilometers, he whispered. "That's less than London to Paris." Reeves gave a low whistle. "So half their invincible tanks never made it out of France alive." Tovey closed the file. "We don't need to outgun them," he said quietly. "We just need to let them keep believing they're perfect." Meanwhile, far from the labs, the cracks were now visible to anyone who drove a Tiger. On the Eastern Front, Tiger 231 of the 503rd Heavy Battalion rumbled through the outskirts of Kirov. Its gunner, Lieutenant Hans Vogel, had stopped calling it the Beast. Now he called it the Burden. He shouted over the roar of the Maybach engine, "Second gear's sticking again!" The driver swore, "Hold her steady." The Tra, in. By sunset, the retreating column left the Tiger behind. A few soldiers stripped its radio for parts. The rest didn't look back. At Chobham, a single gearbox failure required 10 men, a crane, and sometimes an entire workshop to replace. That meant for every Tiger stuck in the mud, dozens of soldiers were pulled from the line to repair it. Tovey summarized it in his final January report. The Tiger is a triumph of fear over practicality. Its design philosophy reflects a dictatorship's psychology, demanding the appearance of strength at the cost of survival. When the report reached the War Office, one colonel simply scrawled across the margin, "Send this to the Americans. It explains everything." By February, the Chobham findings began influencing battlefield tactics. Allied tank units were briefed to exploit terrain that forced Tigers to maneuver. Muddy slopes, riverbanks, narrow roads. Not to destroy them directly, but to make them move. To stress the brittle heart of their machinery. In Italy, too, the British after-action report read simply, "Enemy armor rendered inoperable without direct fire penetration. Mechanical failure probable cause." Meanwhile, in Germany, Kurt Meinhardt received another shipment of failed gearboxes. Burned, twisted, fractured clean through. He turned one over in his hands, tracing the crystal-bright break with a thumb. "It's all coming apart," he whispered. That night, he stayed late, alone in the factory, staring into the roaring furnaces. Each flame looked like an accusation. He wrote a letter he would never send, addressed to no one, signed with only his initials. "We built them too well for propaganda, and not well enough for war. The steel knows. The steel remembers." He folded it, placed it inside the crate with the next batch of gears, and sealed it shut. Somewhere in that shipment, a Tiger on the front line would inherit his confession and its own death warrant. At the Chob, "Reeves, are you?" Tovey hesitated. "For the men, yes. For the machine, no." It's the purest symbol of their war. Too strong to bend, too proud to last. Outside, the night swallowed the lab. And somewhere in the darkness between Surrey and Kassel, two engineers, one Allied, one German, were unknowingly united by the same truth. Perfection, under pressure, always breaks first. February 1944. Berlin, Germany. The snow that month fell gray, heavy with soot from bombed factories. In the Ministry of Armaments, the air reeked of stale tobacco and panic. On the third floor, in a smoke-stained conference room, Albert Speer listened to another engineer drone through statistics about Tiger production shortfalls. "Transmission unit failures remain the chief issue, Minister," said one technician nervously. "Out of every 10 Tigers shipped to the front, at least 4 are returned before first engagement. Reports cite fractured gear teeth, clutch explosions, or total gearbox seizure." Speer's hand twitched. "Then fix it. With respect, Herr Minister," the man replied. "It cannot be fixed without halting production for weeks. We've already shortened tempering to meet quota. We're running on borrowed metal." Silence. The ticking of the wall clock was louder than breathing. Speer finally exhaled. "Then lie. Adjust the reports. The Führer doesn't want failures. He wants numbers." The technician swallowed hard, gathered his papers, and left. Behind him, Speer stared out the window at the broken skyline of Berlin. Below, convoys of Tiger parts rolled toward the railway yards. Each crate gleamed like a coffin. He muttered to himself, "We built a monster that eats its own tail." In Chobham, news of the German armaments crisis arrived through a coded dispatch from MI-10. The lab scientists gathered around the decoding officer as he read the translation. Enemy production compromised by metallurgical inconsistency. Morale among factory engineers reportedly low. Reports suppressed by Ministry of Armaments estimated 40% of Tiger stock non-operational. Dr. Leonard Tovey smiled faintly. "So," he said, "the cracks have reached Berlin." Lieutenant Reeves added, "And they're still calling it invincible." "They have to," Tovey replied. "Admitting the Tiger's weakness would mean admitting the Reich's." He turned to the test bench, where fragments of fractured gears were arrayed like trophies of silence. Each one bore a faint maker's mark: Henschel and Sohn, Kassel. Each one, he realized, was a tiny piece of Germany's undoing. March 1944. Eastern Front near Narva. The snow was black with soot and cordite. Tiger 132 of the 502nd Battalion had spent 3 days attempting to pull back from the front. Each morning, the engine started. Each night, it died. Driver Albrecht cursed under his breath as he tried to shift into third. The lever jammed. He forced it. The gearbox shrieked, then snapped. The tank lurched, shuddered, and stopped. Commander Grass slammed his fist against the turret ring. "Not again!" "They open." Graf looked skyward, where Soviet shells thundered in the distance. "This is no tank," he muttered. "It's a suicide note written in steel." He ordered, that same week, across the Channel. British Command issued Operational Memo 22B-44 to armored divisions in France and Italy. 1. For tank crews who once trembled at the mention of Tigers. The memo was a revelation. It transformed fear into confidence. The Tiger was no longer a god. It was a prisoner of its own design. At Bovington, British instructors used Chobham's findings in lectures for new armored officers. On a chalkboard next to silhouettes of enemy tanks, a line was scrawled in white. By spring, the war's tide had turned. The Allies stormed Italy, prepared for Normandy, and pounded Germany's factories into dust. At Henschel, Meinhardt watched the power flicker during an air raid. When the sirens faded, half the machine stood silent. No electricity, no workers, no future. He picked up one of the last intact gears from the production line. Its surface gleamed like a diamond. It was perfect, dangerously perfect. He turned it in his hand, hearing Tovy's unseen voice in his mind. Hardness without toughness is death. And he knew then, though he'd never met his British counterpart, that somewhere across the ruins of Europe, another man had already written the Tiger's obituary. April 1944, Chobham Laboratory. The TIG, he wrote, "In the final analysis, the Tiger tank is not a triumph of engineering, but of ideology. Its steel reflects its maker, proud, unyielding, and incapable of compromise. It breaks under pressure because it was never allowed to bend." He closed the folder and sealed it with the War Office crest. As Reeves entered the room, he asked quietly, "What will happen to them now?" Tovey nodded toward the crates. "They'll sit in museums one day, polished and revered. People will call them masterpieces. But those of us who saw inside will know. They were monuments to fear." Reeves smiled faintly. "And we? What do we call them?" "Two." In Germany, Speer's ministry continued to churn out reports of technical success, though every engineer knew the truth. Production quotas meant nothing when half the Tigers died on their own roads. By summer, even Hitler was furious. "They break because my generals don't drive them properly," he roared. But the problem wasn't driving. It was design and pride, and a steel so hard it couldn't survive itself. The empire that had worshipped perfection was now collapsing from microscopic cracks. In the silence of Chobham's empty lab, one line of chalk still lingered on the blackboard. Smudged but visible beneath layers of dust, "Strength that cannot bend will shatter." And by then, the Reich had begun to do exactly that. May 1944. Kassel, Germany. The sirens began before dawn. By the time the bombers appeared over the horizon, the Henschel factory was already shaking. Searchlights crisscrossed the sky as the first explosions rolled in like thunder over steel. Windows shattered. Machines screamed. The last Tiger transmission line, the pride of the Reich, was now a furnace of collapsing iron. Engineer Kerr sprinted through the smoke, shouting orders that vanished under the roar of falling bombs. The floor rippled with shock waves. Red-hot shards of roof steel rained down like meteors. "Shut the furnaces," he yelled. "Get the men out." But there was no stopping it. The very heart of the Tiger's birth, the forges that had once burned with ambition, now glowed with destruction. A single high-explosive bomb tore through the main foundry, scattering half-fused gears across the floor. They rolled, still glowing, still perfect, until they cooled and cracked where they lay. When the raid ended, the morning light revealed the truth. The Tiger line was gone. "May," he whispered, "you're free now." For the first time, he didn't feel anger, only relief. The war had destroyed the machine that destroyed itself. That same month, across the channel, Dr. Leonard Tovey received the final intelligence brief from MI-10. Kassel Tiger. He read it twice. Then, without a word, he placed his pen down and leaned back in his chair. The war of steel was ending, not with victory in battle, but with exhaustion in the furnaces. Reeves entered, holding another folder. "Sir, they've confirmed it. The Reich's last high-carbon steel stockpiles are gone. They're switching to soft alloy substitutes for gear casings." Tovey raised an eyebrow. "Soft alloys?" "Yes. They'll run quieter and break even faster." Tovey exhaled through his nose, half amused, half somber. Poetic, isn't it? After all their talk of superiority, they'll end this war fighting with second-rate steel. 2 weeks later, a British convoy of captured Tigers arrived at the Chobham Proving Grounds for final evaluation. Mechanics, officers, and metallurgists gathered to see what was once the terror of Europe. Under the harsh daylight, the machines looked less mythical. Their paint dull, their edges dented, their transmissions silent. Tovey ran his hand across one hull, feeling the cold armor. So much effort, he murmured, just to make a monument to failure. Lieutenant Reeves chuckled. The Germans built temples to power. We built machines that worked. The two men shared a quiet laugh. Then the engines of Allied Shermans rumbled in the distance, faster, lighter, and alive. It struck Tovey then that the war wasn't simply about who built the strongest machines, but who understood weakness, who accepted imperfection and planned around it. Germany's engineers had denied that truth, and their denial had killed their creations. In Berlin, Albert Speer received his own reports. He sat at a long oak desk, surrounded by papers that no longer meant anything. One of them, stamped in red ink, read, "Tiger gearbox failure rate 56%. Production at Henschel halted indefinitely. Ersatz steel ordered from Czech and Austrian facilities." He stared at the words until they blurred. Outside, distant artillery rumbled. He turned to his aide. "Do you know what killed the Tiger?" he asked. The aide hesitated. "Sabotage? The bombings?" "No," Speer said softly. "Pride." He folded the report neatly, placed it in a drawer, and locked it away. As if by sealing the paper, he could erase the shame it carried. Back at Chobham, the scientists prepared their final comparative trials. They pitted the captured Tiger transmission against the British Merritt-Brown gearbox used in Churchill's and Cromwell's. The results were brutal. The British system, though simpler and less refined, survived thousands of torque cycles before wearing down. The Tiger's gear shattered after just 180. Tovey stood silently over the broken remains. Around him, the lab technicians scribbled notes, but he didn't need to. He already knew the conclusion. Reeves glanced up. "Should I file it under mechanical failure?" Tovey shook his head. "File it under human failure." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small shard of Tiger steel, one he'd kept since the first tests the previous year. The piece was still cold and sharp. He placed it on the bench beside the British sample, dull, flexible, unglamorous. There are years. Perhaps, he thought, they had both learned the same lesson. That true strength wasn't in what you could harden, but in what you could endure. He turned to Reeves, who stood beside him, coat collar pulled high against the chill. "You know," Tovey said quietly, "in a way, the Tiger did win something." Reeves, Mixer, they watched as the last orange light faded over the Surrey horizon. A sunset that looked, for the briefest moment, like fire reflected off steel. And somewhere in the ruins of Castle, the same light flickered across the shards of a shattered gearbox. Silent, gleaming, and finally at peace. August 1944. Surrey, England. The air was heavy with heat and silence. Inside Chobham's metallurgy wing, the benches were cleared, the samples labeled, and the war's most secret findings boxed away. Only one set of blueprints remained on the table. A full-scale drawing of the Tiger transmission, annotated with British remarks. Case-hardened 62 HRC. Martensitic fracture. Insufficient tempering. Every flaw circled in red. Dr. Leonard Tovey store. Lieutenant Reeves entered carrying a thin folder marked Final Review. Tiger Project. "The War Office wants a closing statement, sir," he said. "They're sending a copy to Washington. Something that sums up the whole affair." Tovey. Style. T. "In the Tiger tank, we discovered not just the limits of engineering, but the limits of ideology. The machine's failures mirrored its makers, brilliant, disciplined, but blind to humility. Strength without flexibility is weakness disguised as power." Reeves nodded. "And perhaps every war after it. Things. On the outskirts of Normandy, British and American tank crews moved through villages littered with burned-out Tigers. The once feared giants lay tilted in ditches or split open by their own mechanical hearts. Oil leaked into puddles. Transmission housings were cracked wide like eggshells. Private John Hall, a Sherman driver, leaned out of his hatch and stared at one. "So that's the monster," he said. "Looks more dead than deadly." His commander, Captain Hargreaves, nodded. "Aye, they killed more of their own than we ever did. Don't admire it too much. It's a coffin built by pride." The men drove on, leaving behind the wrecks of perfection undone by haste. In Germany, Kurt Meinhardt sat alone inside what was left of the Henschel plant. The once roaring factory was now a graveyard of twisted beams and shattered machines. He held one final gearbox in his lap, the last that would ever bear the Henschel mark. He turned it over in his grease-stained hands. The fracture ran clean through the center, smooth as glass. He smiled bitterly. Even the metal has stopped pretending. He thought of the faces of the young apprentices he'd trained, the night shifts, the air raids, the promises of glory. All gone. All for a tank that could not survive itself. For the first time since 1942, he allowed himself to think of peace. Not victory, not defeat, but peace. He picked up a piece of chalk from the floor and wrote on the factory wall, "No steel is eternal." When the Americans arrived weeks later, they found that message still there, written beneath a half-melted sign that once read, "Tiger Production, Hall 3. Back in England, the Chobham lab prepared to shut down the Tiger study. The crates marked Evidence AE were sent to Bovington for long-term storage. Reeves helped Tovey close the last lid. "Funny," Reeves said. "A year ago, that thing terrified us. Now it's just another box in a warehouse." Tovey nodded. History has a way of turning monsters into lessons. They stepped outside. The evening sun hung low over the proving grounds, glinting off the armor of a British Comet tank being tested nearby. Its engine purred, smooth, confident, alive. Reeves gestured toward it. "We learned a lot from them, didn't we?" Tovey smiled. "Oh, more than they'll ever know." He thought of every mistake the Germans had made. Every over-hardened gear, every skipped tempering cycle. And how those very flaws had taught the Allies to do better. Stronger alloys, slower tempering, designs built for endurance, not ego. Out of the Tiger's failure, a new generation of tanks was being born. Ones that would cross into the Cold War era, built on the ashes of German overconfidence. In the months that followed, the name Tiger faded from intelligence reports. By 1945, it was no longer a weapon, but a relic. The last operational Tigers broke down during the retreat to Berlin, abandoned by crews who had once worshipped them. One of them, found near Magdeburg, was captured intact. Its transmission was jammed solid. When British engineers cracked it open, they found the same signature flaw, crystal-like fracture lines spreading through the gear teeth. The steel had cried one final time. The report from the recovery team was short. Cause of failure: material brittleness due to overhardening, no external damage. It was, unknowingly, the Tiger's epitaph. September 1944. Chobham. Tovey received his final commendation, a quiet letter from the ministry thanking him for contributions to the understanding of enemy metallurgy. There was no fanfare, no ceremony. Just a line that read, "Your findings have materially assisted the Allied war effort." He folded the letter and tucked it away. Then, walking to the window, he looked across the test field where grass had begun to grow between the tank tracks. Reeves joined him. "Hard to believe, sir. It's really over." Tovey nodded. "For them, yes. For us, it's just beginning. Every war leaves its fingerprints on science. What we build next will carry theirs." He turned away, switching off the lights one last time. Outside, The twilight deepened. The crates bound for Bovington rumbled down the road, each carrying a fragment of the myth that had once haunted Europe. The sound of the truck's engine faded into the distance. In the quiet that followed, the war's greatest irony hung in the air like smoke. The Tiger had been destroyed not by Allied firepower, but by the very hardness that was supposed to make it immortal. Strength without mercy, power without patience, precision without soul. And in that failure, the Allies found the secret that would define modern warfare. Not how to make steel harder, but how to make it endure.